Well, hey everybody. Um, Welcome back. So, what we're going to look at today is the Civil War. And again, like I've mentioned a few times, because of the way the curriculum works for this class, we're going to go through everything much quicker than what I would generally do, because really the curriculum for this course starts after the Civil War. But this is kind of the wrap up of all the quick history that we're doing up through the Civil War. So again, and I know I've said this before, but this is why we're going through this stuff so quickly, much more quickly than I generally would like. But you've already had this stuff in eighth grade and probably know a little bit about this already. But that's why we're going through this so quickly. But what I did want to do is to spend a little bit of time today in a few parts here to talk about how the Civil War started, what it was about, why it started, the key events. And that's really what we're going to look at today. So, as you guys can see, what we're looking at the causes of the Civil War, essentially looking at why was it the South decided to leave the country, to leave the Union. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some key events the first time through. So, you're going to kind of think about a timeline, roughly from late 1840s through 1861, the start of the war. Sort of see how, kind of point to some key things that happen that are going to lead us eventually to war. But then we'll kind of also sort of wrap up more generally. This is what I mean by the kind of philosophical reasons. So, what are the kind of general causes of the war? And again, the general reasons why the South decided to leave the country and form their own. And so, we're going to start. I've already had you guys read, and there's a little video I had you watch on the Mexican War. So, to understand this story, we have to start with the Mexican War. So, I have a question for you here. So, how did the Mexican War contribute to the tensions between the North and South? And really, when we think about the answer here, it's really all about land. Again, I don't want to be too simplistic here, but ultimately, that is what it's about. So, what you guys can see, I like this little older map here. So, if we look, where's there it is, flashlight. Um, so, what we have here, you can see modern day Mexico right through here. But notice, this was before the war, this was all Mexico through here. So where we are right now, right there, we were in Mexico. Now, after the war, obviously, United States wins, and Mexico cedes this land. Actually, we paid for it, but we were able to buy it because we won the war. This land all through here becomes the United States. And then later, the Gadsden purchase, we purchased this little sliver of land as well. Now, okay, what does all this have to do with the Civil War? Well, it's all about the balance of the states. And that's ultimately, when we think about this question, that's what we're talking about. You write it down in a very sloppy hand here, but just so we can kind of remember. Balance. And the question is balance of what? Balance between, okay, slave states, so states that allowed for slavery, versus states that did not, the free states, North v. South. That's what this is ultimately about. Now, question for you to think about. Why? Well, two questions. First of all, a little bit about slavery. Why was slavery in the South and not the North? Why was slavery predominant at this point in places like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, but not New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts? Ultimately, it's about climate, what you can grow. Think about what the slaves were doing, working on these big plantations. Now, what's the often misnomer is that they will say, oh, well, the North was urban and the South was agricultural. Well, that's not true. Okay, there were cities in the North more than there were cities in the South, but the farms in the North are going to be smaller So less kind of amenable to the big plantations of the South, but also, guys, the North versus South. What's the other super obvious difference between the two? The weather, the climate. There's a much longer growing season in the South than in the North. So what you have, quite simply, is, well, and this stuff, I hate to talk about this, but slaves are expensive in the South. Very small percentage of the actual people that lived in the South owned slaves. Why? Because they're so expensive. Kind of think of like roughly equivalent to buying like a luxury automobile. And again, I hate even saying that when we're talking about human beings that we're buying and selling and thinking in this way. But that's ultimately why we have this split, North versus South. Slavery goes away much sooner in the North than it does in the South. But I do want to point out, and we'll say this later, is it's not like Southerners are all racist, Northerners are not, because there's going to be racists in the North as well. But slavery, North and South. Now, why do we care about this balance? About making sure the same number of states are slave states as they are free states. Why do we care about this? And the answer is power. The southern states, their slave states, are going to make sure that if new states come into the Union, so as we start adding states to the Union that are free states, they'll be able to outvote the southern states, especially in the Senate. And that could ultimately lead to the end of slavery, which that's not going to be an option for them. Or on the flip side, if there's too many slave states, more slave states than free states, they can make policies that would advance slavery. And the North isn't going to like that. So again, I want to make sure that we have that basic idea in mind before we move on. So, all right. Speaking of balance, what I want to do is real quick, guys, and your book is covering this, but just to understand that there's going to be these compromises in place. And so as we try to struggle with this question of compromise between slave states and free states. So we had already talked previously and read about the Missouri Compromise, which essentially kind of created a line straight across here. Everything above would be free, below not. Well, the problem is that line's not working anymore because now we're figuring out California and these states in here. So the Compromise of 1850 is just a classic example of where we're adding free slave states and then free states to balance them out. And that's the idea. And there's other parts of the Compromise of 1850 that you can read about. But again, you don't have to worry about that right now, other than to say our country is desperately trying to figure out how to keep these two sides happy, slave states, free states, without leading to more conflict. Ultimately, it will be a failure. You're not going to ever deal with the issue. But this is one example. Now, to think about some events that really start to divide this nation up. And that's really what the focus is going to be over the next couple videos here. Is to think about, are there things that happen roughly between 1850 and then the onset of war, when the South leaves the country in 61? What's dividing the nation? And you'll see there's going to be all sorts of different things that do that. And the first one is going to be simply a book, of all things. Piece of fiction. So you may have heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. A book written by this woman. She had her father, I believe, was a minister. I'm pretty sure I got that right. And she, in her travels, I think they had gone to southern Ohio, which is right about the South. She witnessed and saw slaves, being slaves, and she wrote this book about it. And why it's important is that it's a book like this that really kind of uncovers, or reveals, I should say, the real inhumanity of this system. Most people, especially live in the North, they would know intellectually slavery's wrong, it's bad, without really picturing it. And a novel is going to be something that's really going to hit you, right here, rather than just kind of in your mind, intellectually. And so her story, she in her story, she kind of talks about, and there's scenes where, the master makes, one slave beat another slave for not working hard enough or, not obeying properly and kind of the issues with that. Also talking about what's happening with families as families are getting split up and just the complete inhumanity of it, the slave idea of a slave auction or when slaves are being split up to different plantations. I mean, just, imagine that. You're a family and then your son or daughter is sold to one plantation, then you're sold to another, and you'll never see that person again. And just the horror of that. And her book, as you can see here, sells a ton of copies. And that's going to be another big part of this. The book sells a lot of copies. People are talking about this. And today's video would say it would kind of gone viral, I suppose. But like a best-selling book. And then think about, well, like, what is the South going to think of this? What's the South going to think of a book like this? What are they going to call it? Again, if they was talking about today, they'd say it was fake news, right? Oh, it's just these Northerners. Actually, we treat our slaves really well, as a lot of Southern plantation owners would say. And, they're just trying to, exaggerate the situation for sympathy. But either way, this issue now is starting to push itself into the national consciousness even more. Regular people read about it, start to talk about it, start to argue about it. And although clearly by itself, a book like this doesn't cause the Civil War, it was certainly had a huge effect. Even Abe Lincoln himself actually had Harriet Beecher Stowe into the White House and reportedly said to her, like, you're the little lady that started this war. So even then, they understood the impact of this book. And you'll see that throughout our history. Books and literature having just this outsized influence sometimes on these events. Next one I want to talk about is a political event. And yet another one of these compromises. This is you'll see how this works. So another kind of cool old map here, kind of showing you a little bit the slave states, free states, and then still the unoccupied states that are deciding. And notice they kind of left a little blank here in Kansas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was, again, an attempt to try to figure out how we're going to keep this balance between slave state and free. So under the Missouri Compromise, this area was above this line here. So this is really supposed to be a free state once it was organized as a state. Well, we couldn't have that, so we had to repeal it. And what they ultimately decided was that this area, territory of Kansas, would get to decide for themselves whether to be a slave state or a free state. And that's what we call this notion of what we call popular sovereignty. And that was the idea. And that was the deal that they made. And so you can just sort of imagine how this is going to end up. The new settlers to Kansas. You have a lot of folks from this area here coming down into Kansas from the north, abolitionists. Abolitionists are those who want to abolish slavery. And then just imagine what's going to happen when the South, the southern states, especially here's Missouri, start seeing all these northerners settling into Kansas, thinking about, okay, how are they going to vote? Are they going to become a free state? Are they going to become a slave state? Well, you can imagine what's going to happen. Is it's going to worry these slave states, because what's going to happen when Kansas, if they vote free, then we're going to start upsetting the balance, and you start to see the conflict happen. And this is going to be an example where we start to see real conflict happen. A good example of a political compromise that seemed to make sense at the time, but it's really not. When we come back next time, we'll talk about exactly what happened.